Hi, I'm Rich,
Hi, I'm Tom.
and this is the Hytro Performance Podcast, where we sit down to speak to coaches and athletes in our community about all things sport and BFR.
Today we're delighted to have Aaron Borgmann of Borgmann Solutions, who's a seasoned practitioner vet in the NFL with the likes of the Philadelphia Eagles, Kansas City Chiefs, talk to us all things AT and PT specific.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Always appreciate talking to y'all. My name is Aaron Borgmann. I am a physical therapist, athletic trainer here in the U.S. I've done a lot of different things in my career and continue to look to do more.
So, first thing for us is we are all gripped by the Super Bowl journey. Some of us are happy with who's in there, some of us not. Can you give me a little bit of background on your time in the NFL and a professional football game over there?
Yeah, so I spent 12 years essentially full time in the NFL in various different levels and responsibilities. I only made it to the championship game once, and that was in 2008, long time ago, right? And the NFL was a different beast back then. And we got within 3 minutes of going to the Super Bowl. We just didn't finish it off. And so, the Super Bowl was always kind of, the top of the pyramid, if you will, for the sport, right? And so that's what everybody works so long and so hard for. And we got close so many times. And a lot of my friends that are enjoying some success now are spoiled with riches, right? Here in Kansas City, the team is just absolutely killing it yearly. And so I'm very excited for my friends. I'm very excited for my ex-boss, Andy Reid. It's just a good time to be a Kansas City Chiefs fan.
And are you a fan?
I'm not so much a fan of teams anymore because I've gotten out. I used to work for the Kansas City Chiefs. I used to work for the Philadelphia Eagles. I consider myself a fan of people more than teams anymore because my friends are so scattered throughout the league now that I've been out for 5 years. And so I kind of root for everybody. Now, as an employee, a former employee of two teams, there's obviously some hated division rivals there, which are really tough to root for. But again, I root for people so much more now than I do for teams themselves.
Was it always American football for you as a sport? Was that always going to be the route?
No, it's a great question. When I was in college or university, I thought for sure that I was going to do baseball, and because baseball was always my favorite sport growing up, I played it the most. And then I had an internship with the St. Louis Cardinals while I was in college, and I thought, man, this is a long season. This is 162 games and 40 games in spring training, and I had convinced myself that football was less work, which was interesting in the fact that it didn't actually, have that many games. Whereas it turns out after a couple internships in football that I found out that it's actually quite a bit more intense work because everything is so compacted and so tight and so important. And so, no, it wasn't always football, but that's just kind of where the journey led me. And it's funny that the acuity of injury and the rehabilitation, because of the short time frames, are so compressed that you actually, I think, in my opinion, and of course I'm biased, you have to be on your game a little bit more as a practitioner to work in football, just because it is that much more intense of a day-to-day grind.
Yeah, you've highlighted on that. Like, what would you say is potentially the biggest difference you've seen across sports? If we look at the big sports like you've highlighted there, NFL, MLB, for you as a practitioner, especially as an AT physical therapist.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to go back to the intensity of the season, right? When I was in the sport of football, we only had 16 games. Now they have 17. They've extended the season by 1 week. And so because there's only 16 games, those things mean so much more, right? Like every single one is that much more important. And, whereas in baseball or basketball, the season is so much longer. And if you go on a 2 or 3 game losing streak, not so big deal, right? Or even more. Football, that can kill your season right there. And so I think the intensity of the regular season is such a big difference. And then when obviously you get to the postseason and the playoffs, as we've seen now, it ramps up another notch. So for me, that's the biggest difference between the major American sports for sure.
So we've got a couple weeks at the time of recording this until Super Bowl Sunday. What does that athletic prep look like now? Is it, no more injuries, pain-free? Are we still hitting weights? Like, what does that look like?
Well, obviously, anybody once you get to the playoffs you're delineating between the guys that are going to be there for you and the guys that aren't going to make it, right? So it sounds a little bit callous, but you have to prioritize that, and so you have to go with who's going to be there for the next week, for the next week, for the next week. And now that it's the Super Bowl, especially, everything kind of gets pushed to the side. That's an off-season situation, and now it's all hands on deck for the next 2 weeks, right? And so whatever you can do to get those guys back, because now, I mean, let's take, for instance, if you have a person who's 50-50 during the regular season, now there's no more after this, right? So that 50-50 person becomes that much more important to see how much more you can get out of them and make it to the game, because at this point it doesn't matter, if you can only play a quarter, because there's no more after this, right? And so now everything is taken up a notch. All the acuity is ramped up to 11, so to speak, and everything is a mad rush to get every single person possible on the field.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say that, because it's been something that's intrigued me recently. So if we look at players, especially coming into this last round, we look at the likes of a Deebo Samuel, we look at the likes of a Sam Laporta, Mark Andrews, like unbelievably key superstar players on teams who are all going in like 50-50 in potentially even worse splits in chance of making the game. Like, for you as an athletic trainer, like what are the things you're doing differently now in the postseason compared to the in-season, with so much more riding on that player availability?
Yeah, so for me personally, I can obviously only speak to my experience. When there was a big game or a playoff game coming up and stuff like that, you kind of put aside any long-term goals, right? You got to work stage to stage to stage. So if XYZ player is important for the coaching staff to have in the game plan, and they say, hey, look, we need them for 20 plays. All right, what am I going to do to help that player maximize a very small window? Is it a swelling reduction issue? Is it, their quad needs to fire a little bit better and they need to get a little bit stronger real quick? Is it a range of motion issue? Like, they can do everything, but man, they just can't reach high enough as a wide receiver to catch a pass. What do we need to work on? What is the lowest common denominator? Where's the most meat on the bone for me to gain and help that person, which helps the team? Because it's not the same answer for everybody. There's no blanket statement, right? Like, every single player will need something different. And I think that's important to understand, that when you get into those do or die situations, right, you have to really address the specifics of the player and the position, and then what is being asked of them. Because by this time of year, no one's completely healthy, right? Everyone's got a little something. Everyone's nicked up a bit. But so what does that person need? How can I provide that? I think is the most important stage to take a step back and kind of look and take the 10,000-foot view, if you will.
Yeah, and does that role then change in terms of how you approach a game day with these athletes? So we're talking prior to the game, we're talking in-game, because you get more time with athletes in-game, obviously, because of the periods that they're on the side of the field. So what are the tools that you have available, or processes that you would implement that are different, again, because you may just be needing to get these key players in for set plays that are high importance, right? And again, you're taking out of consideration that longevity of having them available.
Yeah, so for sure. And I think part of that comes back to great communication between all the staffs, like the coaching staff, the med staff, the S&C staff. What do we need this player to do on Sunday or Saturday or whenever they might be playing, right? So if this player needs to go for red zone only, right? If this is a goal line situation, what does that player need? Do they need swelling reduction? Okay, well, we're not going to run him to death this week. We're going to work on getting his swelling down so his knee doesn't balloon up, and that way he can jump at the back corner of the end zone. Okay, so one example of a dozen, right? And so the tools, I think, are really important, but more so, I think, how you go about structuring that week, right? So this person needs to get a lift in, they need to get a therapy session in, they need to get some manual work in, but also they need to get some film work in. So how do you balance all that out in the crazy stages of the late postseason? I think that's where the magic kind of lies in team management and athlete management, because as you guys know, there's only so many hours left in the season. So then you work backwards, right? So the Super Bowl is then, okay, so we're going to get there then. and then we need him on the field here. So you start working backwards in a hurry, and that kind of helps place what the priorities are and the process for your week.
In this postseason phase, and I guess a little bit it's position dependent, but trying to take a backward step, what are the most common injuries or pains that you'd be solving at Borgmann Solutions, or even when you're still in franchise? What are the most common injuries that you're managing at this point?
I think you'd be hard pressed to talk to anybody that would say anything different than like the veterans, who have the bulky knees and ankles and creaky shoulders and things like that. So wear and tear injuries for sure. At this point in the season, you don't see many acute muscle strains or anything like that. Guys are pretty much acclimated. It's all kind of combating fatigue and combating ongoing soreness and things like that. And so there's a compromise there, right? Like the guys need their practice reps. That's just a thing. But how do you balance that? How do you balance practice with giving them some off time, with giving them some recovery time, with whatever methods they choose or are delineated to them? And so I think what is really, really important is figuring that out first and foremost. And so I think going there and then again working backward is your biggest step for that.
Yeah, that's where obviously we spoke in the past around how things like BFR is a good tool, right? For whether it's load management or people who are volume impaired, weight impaired. How would something like that get introduced postseason maybe versus in a preseason?
Yeah, so I think what you're looking at there in that situation is utilizing those tools much more, immediately off the field on a potential off day, on a potential lighter day where they can still get good work in, but again, not take all that pounding, not take all that load. I've used it in various situations, like in an underwater treadmill, use some BFR there, or in an anti-gravity treadmill, where you're getting a lot of good work, but at the same time, you're not taking the pounding, you're stressing the system, but you're doing it with a little bit more intelligence as opposed to just going out and running, right? These guys don't need a ton of reps at that point in the season. What they need are quality, and they need to be able to recover quickly from that so they're fresh for the biggest moment.
Yeah. So I'm not going to ask you who you think is going to win a Super Bowl, because someone will think you have the inside track and place a bet and you lose a house and it gets messy, I guess. But so if we move forward from the Super Bowl weekend, next thing up then from a sports audience is, I guess, all eyes look at the combine, right? For the guys coming through. What does that shift in athlete prep and training look like? This is the do or die moment for the kid coming through. Like, what does that training look like, and how is that different to what you would be doing with maybe those veteran players?
So, man, boy, have you guys touched on a hot nerve of mine when it comes to the combine. Because here's the thing, right? All of these young up and coming players, the combine was created for a very good reason. So you could get a bunch of people in one spot and potentially view some people that you had never had access before. That was before all the film, before technology kind of granted us being able to look at any football game or soccer game or whatever anytime, right? Now every one of those games is available in your hands on an iPad or on a laptop, right? And so the combine has really shifted, in my opinion, from a situation that has gained uh, an information gathering situation, right, where you watch these guys move when you haven't seen them previously. Now it becomes almost like what can I do to improve my stock? People have seen me play the game. Now I want them to see me do XYZ drill, or I want them to see me lift this at the lifting session. I actually believe the most important part of the combine is the medical screening portion and the interviews, less so now the physical prep. One of my biggest pet peeves was in April and May when we would get the rookies after we drafted them. All they had done for many, many months was prep for the combine, was run a 40, was, do a broad jump. They hadn't done any football stuff because they were so busy prepping for the combine. And so the very first week of what we would call off-season team activities, or spring camp as it were, was we'd see hamstring pulls and calf pulls and quad pulls because they weren't used to playing football because they had done so much a very specific combine prep. Thankfully, I think we're starting to see a movement a little bit away from that very slowly into more overall athletic prep leading into the combine. And more people are saying, hey, I don't necessarily need to run the 40 as much. I don't need to do as many drills because my tape kind of says what I am now, as opposed to in the past where they were trying to prove themselves. I think so many people can only, if you've played for so long and you have tape everywhere out there, you've played on Saturday nights on ESPN, people know how you can play the game, right? Sometimes the combine can only hurt you. Like if you go out there and you run a really slow time, but you looked great on Saturday, well, now what we're seeing is a little bit of a shift in that dynamic where people are picking and choosing what helps them look the best. And maybe they'll do it at their pro day, maybe they'll do it at the combine. Thankfully, I believe we are seeing less and less injuries in the spring because people are training better overall as athletes now for the combine. And then not only do you do better at the combine, but you also do better afterwards. And so I'm looking forward to seeing if that trend continues. I know there's a very long-winded answer, but you kind of hit one of my pet peeves there.
Yeah, no, I think we're definitely on a very, very similar mindset with the combine. So, like, one question for you on that is, so obviously we look at all the athletes not declaring, so all the guys staying in college, all the guys now going into spring training, so they're continuing, a relative normality of a training adaptation. Would you say that as a potential, if we didn't have the combine and it was just look after we do the medical, we do the essentials, the interviews, we don't do the dashes, we don't do the bench press tests, we don't do all this. If the players stayed with the college, continued training as normal, and they could do their pro day, would that set them up better for then transitioning straight into the NFL and going into transition to a team rather than going into not being with the team and specific combine prep for so long?
Yeah. So again, one of my little things I hang my hat on when I go forward is I think the combine is very valuable for many reasons. I think that if you're going to the combine as a team and you're drafting somebody solely based on what you see there, that's probably not a great strategy because there's all this other tape over there of game film of how they actually played, right? Why would you take somebody based upon a 40 when all this other information is over here? So, it's a little bit of give and take. To your point about if they stayed in college, what we're seeing is so once they become draft eligible now, so few people are actually staying at college and they're going to train with their own people wherever they're from. A lot of Phoenix, Arizona, a lot of Florida, a lot of Texas, a lot of Louisiana, a lot of California, all those good weather states, right? And so they're training on their own with private trainers or other football players that are draft eligible and things like that. And I think that has both positives and negatives, right? I do appreciate the fact that the trend, as we said, is maybe sort of starting to change. I don't think the combine is going anywhere anytime soon. I don't think the 40's leaving. I don't think the bench press. I don't think the drills are leaving anytime soon. I think what you might start to see is people do less and less of it, so that affords other lesser known players maybe to show off a little bit. But let's be very clear: people have a craving for this, and as long as the ratings are up and people keep buying tickets and things like that, they're gonna have it because Americans can't get enough football. And so I think there's a time and a place for it all. But I think we're going to see more and more high level people, especially now with all the NIL money flowing very freely, take that opportunity to go do their own thing more and more. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think we have to let time kind of tell.
I was going to ask you on that actually. So, from a UK team sport point of view, one of the things we remark on the NFL and American football is the specialism of the player's role on a team. O-line, D-line, kickers. The closest thing we have is rugby, and there are positions, but you should be able to play everywhere. So you have that real specialism in American football, and then you touched on, there are camps specifically maybe where people go to prep for certain things. Do you see an increase in that specializing in a particular piece of athletic performance? Is that a trend you're seeing, and how do you feel about that as a practitioner?
Yeah, for sure. I think some of my better friends in the industry are doing some of those things, and we see very, very specific O-line summits or clinics. We see very, very specific wide receiver, defensive back, kicker specialists, as you say. And what we're seeing is that kind of splintering and shattering off of doing, their very specific functional position work all the time, not only leading up to the combine, but now every off season, right? And I think that's a positive thing. I think we can gain elite players at each one of those specific positions from that. Now, is it also a negative thing by not training overall athleticism? Maybe. And so, I think the good ones, and I'm not going to give any shout outs here on this podcast to my buddies, but I think the good ones blend that, very, very specific position, um, elite skills, but also overall athletic training and conditioning at the best ones out there. I think those are the ones that are kind of getting ahead. They're absolutely everywhere here, guys. I mean, you cannot believe how many off-season camps there are, how many draft prep camps there are. If you build it, they will come, right? And so people are always looking at that. I think the difference is the really, really good ones, and then there's just some. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess we're going to see a live test of some of those as we see an exodus of European athletes on the international player pathway. And the news over here was shocking, right? We had some marquee rugby athletes departing almost overnight to go and join NFL player pathways. And we're going to see, I guess, how well those pre-draft camps, those specialist trainers are going to take athletes who have never played a quite complicated sport from our point of view, and transition. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting because, even during my time in the league, we had all sorts of crossover athletes, right? Like there were soccer players that would come be kickers. We had, in my time in Philadelphia, we had an Australian rules football player, a punter forever, and he was fantastic at that. He was the biggest punter the league had ever seen. He was a huge human being. There's been several instances of rugby players making the transition with, limited results here and there. I think because the sports are so different, first of all, rugby players and Aussie rules football players are way, way tougher than American footballers, way, way tougher. But I think the transition there is different because it's not to your point, it's a very specific sport with very defined roles, whereas all those other things have a more holistic athletic athlete, right? Rugby players, to your point, have to do a little bit of everything. And, some of the analogous positions here would be running back or linebacker or things like that. And so that we've seen some crossover there for sure. Offensive lineman has had some success with that. Defensive lineman a little bit with some wrestlers, things of that nature. Offensive lineman the same way. But, it's this balance, right? So you're taking somebody who's a really good athlete at everything, a rugby player, running, tackling, scrumming, jumping, and then trying to pigeonhole them into one position. Well, that doesn't always work, right? Because our positions in American football, like you said, are so well defined, and you do X, Y, Z, right? Now we're seeing more and more dynamic athletes come out to play American football here and do more and more things. So it'll be an interesting trend to see moving forward. I happen to be part of a very small group that did NFL Europe for a little bit. And, it was interesting to see some of those athletes cross over and try to do American football. At the time, it wasn't great, but you could see that it was improving, right? And so I think that's only gotten better as athletic performance has improved, not only here, but also worldwide. And so, it'll be interesting to see the crossover because I can tell you this from my experience. Rugby players, Aussie football players, things of that nature coming here to play are going to have way more success than the inverse of going and playing rugby or Aussie rules or, whatever, Gaelic football or hurling or anything like that. Like, it's just not going to go as well because they're so hyper specific here, right? So I think it's an interesting conversation.
But on that, quickly, do you think there's a reason that, for example, O-line, D-line role positions have become more adaptable for crossover players compared to, like, we're still to see, for example, a rugby player transition into a wide receiver role. And, we've got some lightning fast players. Like, what would you say the key reason is that it's less of the skill positions and more of those foundational O-line, D-line positions that seem to be more adaptable?
Well, you're going to laugh at me, but I think in my time period, and I know that's only increased, that some of the O line and D linemen are the best athletes on the field. Now, you may not actually get to see that in real time because of what they're asked to do, but the offensive linemen guys, they are coming out and being some of the most freak athletes and can do everything out there. Now, they're huge, right? So they're never going to be a running back and carry the ball as much as what some of the smaller running backs are. But we've seen them now do those roles, become blocking lead backs, become tight ends in different situations and catch the ball on the goal line. I think seeing the O line kind of turn into, when I first got into the league, the O line were these big, hulking human beings that, didn't do much but just road grade people out of the way, right? Now we're seeing the tides turn at the position and just become these unbelievable athletes. And I think to our previous discussions about how good that athletic performance in general is just kind of making everyone better overall athletes, the O linemen have taken that to heart, and that's a little bit in part to some of these really, really good specialized clinics and camps here, creating them in that manner. And I think again, the elite people are doing that very, very well. As far as the crossover, the lightning fast people, we've seen some rugbyers come over and be decent running backs for a little time, kick returners, because that's kind of what they're used to doing. That's more analogous to their skill set than, going from a dead stop to blushing through the line. Like that's not the same, right? And so I think kick returner has been really fortuitous for rugby players and things like that nature. A little bit of linebackers here and there, things like that. Yeah, I think, kind of just basically what we've said about everything, that I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next.
So, as the demands on players and also the ability level of players to be more flexible and be more complete athletes changes, as a practitioner and a coach, how do you you've been in the game for a while? As a younger coach or practitioner, how do you stay across all the information that's coming out, all of the best practices? Is it peer to peer? Do teams like to share, or is that the secret sauce and don't tell anyone how we got our players fit? How does that work in the industry?
No, first of all, I think if you're good at what you do, you can rely on the basics more than anything before you get too fancy with anything. I think any expert in the field, and I'm not calling myself that by any stretch of the imagination, but anybody who's really good and done it for a while will tell you that the basics are the most important part, as opposed to all the fancy stuff that we see on Instagram and things like that, right? Simple things done well will lead to better results. So that's first and foremost. Secondarily, if you're a good clinician, you don't care who knows what you do. I liken it to a chef, a world famous chef, Gordon Ramsay, sharing his recipes. He doesn't care if people have his recipes. He knows that he can do it better than anybody else because his skill and his technique over years and years of doing it, right? So I'm happy to tell people what I do all the time, because not only do hopefully they learn from it, but then I learn something from them that I might not have seen or that I might not have thought of. And so, in my experience, the best clinicians are those that talk back and forth to others. You're not going to ever gain anything or grow by being a hoarder, so to speak, and thinking that you've got the one way that no one else knows about. If anybody tells you they invented an exercise or a method, I think they're full of it and they're lying to you, because we all kind of steal from each other and put our own little tweaks on things and things like that. But if I'm not talking back and forth to people, then I'm not learning. And Lord knows I need to learn every day, because if I'm not, then I'm getting passed by. So I try to talk to people as much as possible and learn from them. And hopefully in the process, I can talk to either younger clinicians or clinicians that don't necessarily have my niche knowledge or experience, and kind of bring something else to the table. So I think that's the most important part of becoming, an experienced clinician, is being able to exchange ideas and learn from others.
Yeah, we that speaks so much to Hytro as a company and our mission as well. One of the reasons why we love working with you. Really, for us, it's we feel that we are developing this idea of performance BFR and blood flow restriction or occlusion training, not just being in a rehab setting, but being able to prepare, train, and recover athletes better. And actually, what we need is more coaches, clinicians, practitioners taking the science of BFR and applying it in different ways in the field, in the pre-workout, in the ice bath, in the sauna. Tom has done amazing research with some of the clubs we have over here. Is there anything else you're seeing, whether it's applied science or new modalities or new tech, that is really going to push that athletic potential in performance or recovery and rehab?
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to take a step back from what you said and say the thing that I'm seeing the most that excites me is less about the tech. Obviously, the field of sports science, the field of athletic performance, there's always the next thing, right? There's the next new toy, there's the next fancy gadget. We're seeing more objective things come out, which definitely help. But what I'm impressed by is the creativity from the clinicians that is being sparked by some of the simple things. Taking an exercise or taking a modality, for instance, and doing it in a new way. That's the stuff that kind of gets my creative juices flowing. For instance, you mentioned doing a BFR technique in different sauna or aqua or different environments there, or using it on the bike in between hockey periods. Those are the types of things that I think where people are experimenting is not the most solid word, but I like that because that's how we learn, right? That's how we say, well, I haven't ever seen this done, so let me try this and see what the results are. And yeah, you fail sometimes and it doesn't work, but that's okay because A, then you can check it off your list, and then B, you can move on to the next thing. And so that's where I see our industry really growing is people using some of the new advances, such as Hytro and others, and then being creative with it and then exploring new avenues for which to get people stronger and recover and things like that. Because without that, we're still doing the same things that we were 15 years ago. And that doesn't help any of our athletes, right? So that's the thing that I'm excited about and that I see daily is people doing new things and new ideas, even with established items, or taking the new stuff for what is in one intended use and kind of flipping it on its head and saying, what if I do this? What if I do this? And that creativity kind of gets me excited.
It's like on that, at the pro level. So like at pro level, you can't take the risks the same. Like you can't test out with your players as much. Like there's so much more on the line. In that sense, how do you think we can get better at learning more about our athletes to feed that information through to? Sounds terrible, but who's the guinea pigs? Like how can we test this better? How can we send that information up the chain better? And how can, for example, like practitioners themselves, how can they know where to find that information or where to tap into to explore that information better?
2 points. One, I'm the guinea pig. I try everything that I do on people, just so I at least understand what it feels like. Now, we've never met in person. We've talked several times. No one's going to confuse me with a professional athlete anytime soon, right? But I can do everything. I was always told by my athletes that all you do is demonstrate things 2 to 3 times and then tell us to do it 15. And I'm like, okay, so yeah, you get paid to do it. I don't. So the point being is, I think what's really important for all practitioners and clinicians is to try things out for themselves. That way you can at least experience what the athlete is going through. That's one. Two, I think if you're not using the off season or spring practices in our case, or whatever your downtime is in your sport or your performance industry, to try some of those new things out, even on the high performance guys, you can do it when it's not crucial times like this week. You're not trying anything else out new, right? This is not the time to play games. You go with the established stuff because you've got such a little amount of time. 2 months from now, when guys are mulling about the building, they're starting their off-season workouts. Yeah, this is a new thing. Let's try this. Let's see how you like it. Those are the times where you can really expand your horizons and bend your processes, because then when it does come time for this time next season, you've got an established protocol. You've got some knowledge base to work with. And so, yeah, you don't want to do it on your starting quarterback now, but you might in 2 months in the off season when you've got time to kind of wiggle with that. And so not being afraid to try new things, even with the big boys or the big girls, the important people, I think is important for them, because if you do it with confidence, you say, hey, look, I really think this could help, your recovery or your strengthening or your mobility. Let's try this now. Not only do you learn something about it, but then you gain a little bit of rapport and trust with said athlete. And that's only going to benefit everybody down the road.
I guess building on Tom's question, to help those practitioners and coaches on that journey, we hear different different responses, and maybe it's personal, but like, how important is an existing library of research, whether it's lab-based or field-based, on these new techniques and modalities to test? How important is that for someone in the industry to have first, to make the decision, to introduce it to your big athlete and try and like de-risk the situation? Or do you think there's still space out there to be like, you know what, let's just try it and see what happens?
Yes, I think it's both. I think it's absolutely imperative to have some hard science backed information tucked away somewhere. I do not do well with reading research articles. My wife, the PhD, has to interpret a lot of that stuff for me, just because it's not a great skill set. So I actually do better listening to things and watching people do things. I listen to a ton of research based podcasts to have people explain the research to me. I think that's how I absorb stuff better. And then I can take that to practice. So that's the first answer to your question. I think that's imperative, because if we're not following some research-based stuff, then we're just throwing darts at the board. And I'm not like your English dart throwers. I'm terrible at darts, so I'm never going to hit it. But I think that's a very, very big key. Now, what you do with that information, once you have that solid base, then you can kind of branch off in different directions with it. Because if you know you're starting from a solid base of information, then you can kind of let your creativity flow. And what if I did this? Or how about I try that? Or this is what this said, but what if I do these parameters with that technique or tech or whatever it might be? I think you start from known quantities, both either experiential or scientific, and then you branch out from there. And then you might have to pull back. That's fine, because then again, you've learned something, right? You've either learned that it doesn't work, or you can keep moving with it. So I think the answer to your question is both, because, and a lot of times you might have a known thing, right? But it might not necessarily be backed by science. But hey, look, 20 years ago when I had this big giant swollen knee and I had to get him ready for a game the next day, the high volt stimulation really helped overnight. Okay, well, let's try it. We got nothing to lose, right? And so a little bit of both.
Here's one for you. Bringing it back to BFR, we've seen the application of BFR in a healthy athlete unlock 1-2 more percent either in a strength cycle, getting back to game time quicker to be able to increase the volume of training, or even just manage pain. Is there any one athlete that you've worked with that you would be like, man, if we had some applied BFR at this point to get this athlete able to increase their output or get 1-2% more, like, who's that athlete and what kind of difference do you think that would have made?
So my big time rehab experience in the NFL was winding down as BFR was hitting mainstream. We used it a lot toward my time as it ended in the NFL, and now it's used ubiquitously, right, for 18 different things. And so, I look back on our knowledge of BFR and what little we knew and how to apply it in the early days. And not that I needed BFR at the time, but some of the athletes that I worked with specifically here at the Kansas City Chiefs, if I knew how to use it better and I had more experience with it, like we had an all-pro running back that I wanted to use it a little bit better with him. We had an all-pro linebacker that I rehabbed 2 Achilles surgeries from him. I would have liked to have used it more intelligently with him. We used it in both of those cases. I'm not sure I was the greatest practitioner with BFR at the time. It was new. And so looking back on what we know now about blood flow restriction, I think it would have been imperative to use it more efficiently, different situations, things like that, on those athletes to possibly come with a different result to extend their careers a little bit more. We always say you only got so many reps in you. It's my job to give you the most amount of reps possible, right? So I think in that regard, I would like to go back in time and have the knowledge that we have now about BFR as opposed to those early stages. And so, the 2014, 2015 years would have been nice to know as much about BFR now as I know as I did then, or put it in then, excuse me. And so that's my commentary. I think that the field has expanded so much, right? And we've learned so much about how to maximize people's potential with BFR. I've used BFR from, all pro world linebackers to knee replacement patients. And so I think the knowledge base that we have gained from that, I think would be nice to have back then. That's my answer.
Slightly niche one for you now. So, looking at BFR and its obviously its impact on recovery, and that sort of growing utility of it now. Two areas in particular. If we're looking at collegiate level, pre-season camp, and we're also looking, let's say, relatively specifically like pro level rookie camp, you know, these guys coming in and what they're getting put through. Like, what's your take on the impact that's that introduction of BFR could have in terms of allowing these players to adapt better, recover better during these intense periods? Because a lot of the players going into it, especially at college, and especially in the first years, have not trained at that level before and that intensity.
Right. I think it's an interesting point because what we're seeing now more and more is additional rules and regulations put on how much time people can practice, how much time you can be in the building, things of that nature. So what does that do? Unintended consequences, right? That means that people are upping intensity for those time periods. So does that mean we have to recover better and smarter? Absolutely. And so when you change one thing, there's always a trickle down effect, right? So now what we're doing is we're saying you can only be on the field for this amount of time because these are the new rules and standards, either by collective bargaining agreement in the NFL or by NCAA rules in college football. And so does that mean that the coaches are ramping intensity because they know they've only got so much time now? Yeah, in some cases it does. And so then recovery becomes all the more important because while they might have more time, right, which time is very important to recover, it's how you use that time. And I think what intelligent medical staffs and S&C staffs and performance staffs are doing is they're giving athletes more tools such as BFR to maximize their time in that window. You know, the great thing about blood flow restriction is in some instances, it's kind of become a cheat code for some of these recovery strategies and some of these strengthening strategies. And because there's more time in order to use things like BFR, I think what's important to notice is that clinicians in all specializations are doing that because they have more access, they have more time with the athlete, and the athlete is more knowledgeable about how they have to take care of their body. So I think it's a kind of a holistic approach, right? To your point, I think we're getting better at prepping everybody for the next day. It used to be run athletes into the ground, train hard, train hard, train hard, train hard. And while that's still the case in some areas, now it's how do we prepare for the next day? How do we get ready for the game? How do we get them back after the training hard? And so I'm enjoying seeing the trend in the industry. I think it's important that it continues, and I think it's important that we all kind of learn from it and learn how to do better by the athletes. And I think that's the answer to your question in a long form.
That was good. No, you covered it, yeah.
So one last question from me. Really interested to hear what you think about this. In your time, what is the trait or theme you've seen that makes the difference between a good and a great coach or practitioner?
Oh, man. So listen, I think what makes a good practitioner, such as ourselves, or a good coach, be it a sport coach or a athletic performance coach, I think it's attention to detail. And I'm going to answer that and break off again by saying not only attention to detail, but not so much finding out what you need as the practitioner out of the athlete, but what the athlete needs out of you. Okay, because every single one has different mental needs, physical needs, things that nature. I was taught a long time ago that you got to find out what the other person wants. It's not how you want to be treated, it's how they want to be treated, right? And so that comes with different positional demands, that comes with different places in life. Is it a veteran? Is it a rookie? Do they have contract stipulations? Are they on a new contract? Do they have incentives they have to meet? Do they have to get to this game? Is it okay if they miss that one? And so all that folds into attention to detail. What are my hours? Like how many times am I going to see this person this week? What are the high points I have to hit? What is, even in that 1 hour that I have on this day, what do I have to get done? Prioritization and detail is, in at least elite sport, I think one of the biggest things that people don't take enough time for.
And so one further question then, what makes, from your time working with numerous pro athletes, what is the difference between a good and a great athlete?
I think the lazy answer with that question is genetics, right? Because some people are just really, really gifted. And it's true. It really is true. Some of the some of the best athletes I've seen in the world never tried, not once. They didn't work hard at it because they're just that good. They roll out of bed and they're an all pro or a pro bowler. Um, and so that's amazing to watch, right? But what I find is the people that are really, really great athletes that'll end up being in the Hall of Fame, that will end up being talked about more than the ones that are just phenomenal athletic specimens, because I think there's a difference there. Again, attention to detail and how much they put into their craft, right? So those are the people that are working on the side when they're not in the drill. Those are the people that are talking to coaches and reviewing play calls on the side when the starters are out and the second teamers are in. The great athletes are over here talking to the coach. What if we do this, this, and this? Those are the people that come in for extra recovery on their off day or extra mobility work or whatever. They're taking and looking for the 1%, because at the elite level, they're all amazing, right? They're all very gifted. It's the people that get that extra 1, 2, 3%, and they go the extra mile. They say, look, I've got 15 years to play this game. I have to maximize it. Those are what I think make great athletes.
That's an awesome answer. Aaron, this has been amazing. Always really, really insightful to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully this isn't the last time that we get to speak to you on the Hytro podcast.
It's been great, guys. Thanks for having me.